Popular culture sells you a fantasy of secret martial arts. The FBI, CIA, and Navy SEALs train something far more practical and brutal. Here is what they actually do. Elite agencies do not teach martial arts mastery. They teach combat effectiveness under extreme constraints. Unarmed combat is a last resort, a secondary skill to firearms and tactics. The primary goals remain consistent: create space to access your weapon, control a subject for apprehension, or survive and escape a violent encounter. There are no secret techniques. The training relies on extreme simplicity, gross motor skills, and overwhelming aggression. You do not need a black belt. You need to execute one or two techniques reliably under stress. That is the standard. The secret is that there is no secret, only repetition and violence of action. The FBI's defensive tactics program draws from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for ground control, boxing for striking fundamentals, and tactical systems for weapon retention. Agents train in business attire because that is what they wear. The emphasis falls on legally defensible techniques. You must recertify regularly because these skills perish without practice. The FBI does not teach flashy moves. They teach you to close distance, control a wrist, or deliver a straight punch while keeping your firearm secure. If you cannot do it in a suit on a tile floor, it does not work. That is the standard you should apply to your own training. For CIA case officers, hand-to-hand combat is a worst-case scenario tool. Their training is a crash course in breaking holds, creating distraction, and escaping to safety. They do not learn prolonged engagements. Their most potent weapon remains their cover story and intellect. For paramilitary officers in the Special Activities Center, training mirrors Special Operations units. But for the average case officer, you get a handful of techniques drilled until they become instinctive. You learn to strike the throat, break a wrist grab, and run. That is the curriculum. Simple, brutal, and designed for one purpose: survival. Navy SEALs and Special Operations Forces train a hybrid system. They use line training for basic blocks and strikes, BJJ and wrestling for ground control, Krav Maga for weapon threats, and Muay Thai for clinch striking. This toolbox approach gives them options across ranges. But the elite nature comes from physical conditioning and mental fortitude, not secret techniques. You can learn the same individual techniques. The difference lies in how they train: high volume, high intensity, and under realistic stress. If you want to close that gap, you must train the same way. The Soviet approach to unarmed combat relied on sambo, boxing, and indigenous wrestling. Combat sambo includes strikes and submissions designed for military application. Systema, as marketed in the West, is a modern interpretation. The original training focused on extreme conditioning and psychological hardening. The goal was to incapacitate an enemy as quickly as possible with no regard for sporting rules. You see this in the techniques: eye gouges, throat strikes, groin kicks, and joint breaks. Brutal and simple. That is the template. You do not need complexity. You need the willingness to act decisively. Despite their effectiveness, agency programs have inherent limitations. The perishable skill problem means techniques degrade without constant practice. Most operators prioritize firearms and tactics over hand-to-hand. The toolbox approach lacks unifying principles. You may know what to do but not why, so when a technique fails, you have no backup. Training is often segmented: striking from one instructor, grappling from another. This creates gaps in transitions between ranges. Finally, the goal is to create a combatant, not a martial artist. You get output, not deep foundational mechanics for lifelong progression. These gaps matter for civilians who train for self-defense. White Lotus Combatives addresses these gaps directly. You learn a unified system of mechanics that applies across all ranges. Strikes flow into clinch work flows into takedowns, and takedowns flow into ground control. You learn the why behind each technique, so you can adapt when something fails. The training focuses on gross motor skills that survive stress. You build a foundation that improves over a lifetime, not a crash course that degrades in months. You do not need to be an operative to train like one. You need the right principles and consistent practice. Elite agencies train for specific contexts. You can apply the same principles: simplicity, aggression, and consistent practice. Focus on what works, not what looks impressive.